how many people here got into software development because of games, like tied into games somehow? Like you wanted to write a game, you wanted to pirate a game, whatever. So like, right, so a lot of you, well, that's exactly what the story was with me. The exact same thing, like I just got into this programming thing, and I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my journey where I tried to be a game developer in the 90s and didn't work. And then came back to it years later, but I never got rid of the programming part, right? Because that was the fun stuff. So my name's Jeremy Morgan. I know some of you here, but most of you, I don't. I'm a software engineer, generally, DevOps engineer, and most recently I'm an instructor. So about 5 years ago, I did a pivot from day-to-day DevOps engineer into an instructor role. And you might notice that none of that says game developer, because I am not a game developer. And that's pretty much why I'm showing this. I'm just a software engineer geek guy, but I love retro games. And I recently rediscovered these things, and then I dug into building them. So in this talk, I want to talk everybody into becoming game developers and building your own game, like maybe even this weekend. And I think if I show you the basics here, I think at least half of you will probably go back and look at it and be like, this is so cool, this is so easy. So that's my whole goal, is like, why retro games? Why are those cool? And why now? That's gonna be pretty much my talk. So they say, I don't know where I read this, but they say somebody's favorite video game is usually the one that was released when they're 12 years old, or that they played when they were 12, like on average. That's your favorite console, that's your favorite game. For me, that's absolutely true. I was 12 years old in the late 1900s, so we had the Atari 2600. Yeah, I don't know if anybody remembers that. Yeah, that was pretty awesome. That was a great console. My favorite, the original 8-bit NES, so I loved it. Sega Genesis. TurboGrafx 16, anybody? See, nobody, I don't even remember seeing one of those, but I remember seeing the commercials all the time. And so I wanted to make games when I was playing these types of things, but there was just no way to do it. I mean, you just couldn't. They're big companies building with licensing and things like that, but you could for a PC 286, which would be the other game console of when I was 12 years old. And so at one point, a friend of mine and we were talking about building games. Both of us were like, we want to build games. We really want to do it. We found this Sony NetYaroze thing. And it was a Sony PlayStation, but it had all these different ports on it. It had an SDK with it. It had all this cool stuff. So we're like, yeah, we're going to get that. It was like $750, which back then, as a teenager in the 90s, that was a lot of money. When we did come up with the money. And then by the time we contacted Sony, they're like, yeah, we're not doing that program anymore. So we're like, oh, I guess we're not going to be famous PlayStation developers after all. So then I got into the C++ game, because that was the only other option for an independent single person to do development. I bought this book, Teach Yourself Game Programming in 21 Days, and I went cover to cover through this thing. Some of y'all might recognize this. This is a pretty popular book at the time. It took me far longer than 21 days, I'll admit. Nowhere near 21 days, but I hammered on this thing for like a year building these things. And we're building it in C++ using mode 13H. It was a pain in the butt. I also bought this book, giant graphics book, and this is written by somebody that's like a graphics genius, you know, and he helped with the Quake engine, several cool graphics things, and I read that, and this was kind of like a brief history of time for me. I read that book too, and I understood a small percentage of it. That's exactly how I feel about the graphics programming black book. I learned stuff, I didn't understand it fully. So back then, in the 90s, when I first started, what were the barriers to building your own games? Well, you had to know C++ really well. I learned C++, but I wouldn't say I know it very well, even to this day. But you have to know C++ really well. Also I/O, memory, VGA graphics. So back then, you used to have to draw a screen. That's what this little demonstration is you would have, so mode 13H is 320 by 240, 256 colors, which today we think about that and it's like, that's ridiculous. But you would take that and you would actually draw screens, and you would put screens into a screen buffer, you know, and you'd have to load like 10 of them into this pipeline, and you had to know how memory works, how VGA cards work, how video memory, which at the time, I think 1 megabyte video memory on the video card that I was using. So it was very tricky. You had to have an expensive compiler, so that C++ compiler that comes with the 21 Days book. Pretty good. It was like a minimalized MSVC, worked okay, but if you wanted to really build games, you're gonna have to buy some thousands of dollars worth of Borland products or MSVC, the good kind, and you also have to purchase expensive libraries and SDKs. So if you wanted to do a 3D game back then, you could either write it yourself, take 5 years to do it, put it together, learn assembly language, all this, or you could pay a whole bunch of money to people who would give you that. And so the reason I bring this up is not to be a big whiner, but it's because it's so much better today. So before, you'd have an idea for a video game. You're like, I'm gonna make this video game, throw a whole bunch of money at it, throw a whole bunch of time at it, get frustrated like crazy, and then you would have a game 6 months later, a year later, right? But now, today, in 2025, we have Phaser, which is what I'm gonna talk about here, and a million other libraries. So what are the barriers now? What do you need to do now? Well, you need to know some JavaScript. That's cool. I don't even really know JavaScript that well. I'm a backend developer, and I honestly am not super strong with the DOM and JavaScript and all that, and I'm able to write games all over, so. You need to know nothing about hardware. So I talked about all that like memory addressing and stuff. You don't need to know anything about that. You don't need to know interrupts and IRQs for controllers. None of it. And you have cheap or free developer tools, which I'm going to show you as a part of this. And I got to speed it up here, I can see. Cheap or free libraries and SDKs. So there are tons of libraries out there. Tons of SDKs, and I'll show you itch.io is one of them that I spent a lot of time in. It's a silly name for a website, but it has a bunch of cool stuff on there. So now you just get an idea, you spend a little bit of time, you're a happy developer because it's actually a really nice development experience, and you have a game in a weekend. That's the promise, build a game in a weekend. Absolutely possible. If you can open a browser, you can make a game. So I'm going to show you some of the basics of just a very, very bare bones Phaser game. This one is called Catch the Apples. And what I did is I did a series of YouTube videos. So I did 3 YouTube videos where it's like, let's build a video game from scratch, a 2-dimensional retro style game from scratch. And I tried to make it just as bare bones as I could. And if you look at this, you've got a config file. This is an object. Can everybody see the screen, by the way? Oh. Okay, let's see. Can I drag it over there? Yeah, I can drag it over there and then point, I guess. So there's a config object here. That's pretty easy to figure out. You've got type Phaser, and there's different types of Phaser games. Game styles that you do. This is just auto, so I don't know. I've always put it on auto, and it figures out what you need to do. But width and height, 800 by 600, right? Pretty standard. And then there's physics. There's arcade physics, and there's realistic physics. Arcade physics are super easy to work with, so that's generally what I use. And then some other settings in our scenes. Yeah. Let's see. We'll close the Explorer. There we go. So you've got that config object here, and then you just create a new game instance. And then there's 3 main functions that you see here. And like I said, this is very bare bones, a big, huge Phaser game. I'll show you an example of that. But this is very bare bones, and it has preload, which is pretty easy to figure out, right? This is the stuff that you want to load up and keep in storage to use. You have create function. That's run one time, and that's when the scene starts. This game is only one scene, so it's just, you know, create function is called one time, and then update is called 60 times a second. So I'll show you what a preload looks like. Pretty straightforward, right? So I have a background. I created some stuff on my iPad with a little pixel art background. Created a pail and an apple. And so I'm gonna make an apple fall from the sky, and we try to catch it with a pail. These are all loaded up under background, player, and apple. And then during create, this is the one that's run one time when the game starts. It'll add in my background image, position it at the center of the screen. We're gonna replace rectangle with sprite. I left that comment in there because earlier in the video I made it just a rectangle, but so this is a sprite and it's player, so it's just loading up that little graphics file as a sprite. And then there's an apple sprite, and then we have enable physics. And this is basically just says anything in the game that moves has to have physics assigned to it. And so it's very abstracted, very much in the background, but it does things like gravity, collision detection, all that kind of stuff. And that's all the code it takes to make something a playable, movable object. And then we create the player controls here, and then just a few little, score, item speed for how fast they're gonna fall. And then I add a little score text at the top that says score equals 0. Now update here is called 60 times a second. So this is the one that just constantly loops all the time, over and over and over. This is the one where you make a mistake in this function, you know it immediately, because it's whatever bad it does it fast and hard. And yeah, you can overload consoles, or not console, but overload your browser memory and all kinds of fun stuff. So here, we're just constantly checking for this threshold to see where the score is. I have this little score increase, so when your score goes up, the apples fall faster. And all of that is done in this simple little function here. Move player left, move player right. If you ever did anything with C#, C++, or anything regarding controls and keyboard bindings and stuff, this is so brilliantly easy and simple. And like, this is just like move the player 5 pixels as long as that button is held down. So this is the amount of code that you have to write to put these things together. And I reset the item, so when the apple falls to the bottom of the screen, I just reset it and put it in a random spot. And then we check for overlap, and this is collision detection. We're just basically seeing, does the apple hit the bucket? If it does, we'll increase the score, and we'll reset, and we'll drop another one from the top. And this is really all the code for this game, which I'll start up. Now, I'm not going to say it's a super impressive game, but it is a shockingly low amount of code, in my opinion. Fire this thing up. Sorry, it is a little awkward over on the screen. And where did that browser go? Oh, here it is. Okay. So I'll load this up. Does this feel like pretty easy stuff? Or am I crazy, or is this like a small amount of code for a game? It is cool. And so I'll refresh it because they're going wild there. And yeah, you move this back and forth and just try to catch the apples. You can see the apple speed obviously is a little high. So gravity times 10. But yeah, so what's really cool about Phaser is just it abstracts so many things. It, like I said, with the keyboard controls, things like that, it abstracts so much. I'm going to go into some tools here. Oh, just a little bit so I can see this. So you can see some of the tools that you use. Obviously, Visual Studio Code, right? That's pretty much a standard for me for I don't know how many years. But that's how I prefer to write it. But I'll show you in a minute. There's another one. I'm saving it for the end, right? There's tools like this Pixelator, or Piskel is one of them. You can take these tools and just draw the little pixel art. Like I drew this bucket and the apples, and then I used, I think, Midjourney to do the background. So if you're not an artist, like me, I'm not an artist, but if you're not, you can still get this, or you can go to itch.io, which I'll bring up. And here's another one that I wanted to show. So I have a more complex game that I put together, and in there, in the levels, I don't know if you can see this. This is something called tiled, where it takes that entire screen that you were looking at earlier, and this is for a different game, but it takes this entire screen, and you can just drag over these little bitmaps, put them into place, and then export this as a JSON. It makes this big, huge, unreadable array, but it's like super easy, and this thing was $10, I think. Something like that. It's like ridiculously cheap. But this is one of the tools that I like to use a lot because I can just drag these things over, And like I said, I can just export it. I'll show you what it looks like exported. We'll go to the more complex game real quick. And this one is called Totally Awesome. And this is one I built a few years ago on a live stream. And so you can see with this one, it's far more complex than the whole single page thing that I had before. I've got collision manager, enemy manager, all this stuff. And have all my assets. And then here's like terrain.json. This is what that tiled program generates. Like nobody's gonna wanna write this by hand, right? So this tiled program is just amazing. And I think most people probably would too. I did start by doing these by hand and start putting them together. I'm like, this is terrible. And then I found tiled. I was like, all right, so that's cool. So tiled is one of the really good ones. There's the good pixel editors. And then there's something so I built this game in Visual Studio Code with no AI and all this stuff years ago. And then they came out with the Phaser editor. I think this thing is like $150 a year, something like that. But this thing is really cool. I'll admit I haven't gotten into using it quite as much as I should. But when I do, there's all kinds of cool stuff. So you have things where you can do basic JavaScript, Byte, Webpack. They have starter packs here where you can do like simple A Day at the Beach, Angry Balls, Flappy Chicken. There's some good names here, right? Sunnyland Forest. And these are all just pre-made games that you can just use as a template. And so you could start that up and then you can go in and modify all your bitmaps and do all your stuff. And it's really cool. It also has things like Angular, Fun, etc. Just a whole bunch of cool stuff. So like I haven't really dug into it too much, but I did purchase it and I did use it, and I'm probably going to use it on my next one. Now, one of the things, so I tried to keep AI as much out of this talk as I could because that's all I talk about these days is AI, like most everybody else. But we're going to skip through this because we don't have time. But I guess I could cover this. Yeah, I can cover this really quick. So what we just looked at, there's 4 core pieces to every Phaser game and app. There's a config. That's that simple basic JS object. There's scenes, which we only had one scene there. But if you think of it, scenes as like routes or pages. That's all they are. There's, the beginning screen, level 1, level 2, level 3, ending, etc. There's game objects, which I showed you those sprites. Things like the bucket, the apple, the walking person. And then there's just systems. And systems is mostly all the background stuff that you choose it and it works on its own, like the physics and things like that. You don't really have to do a lot of things with physics and collision detection and all that. It's just a line of code, and that's all in the systems part of it. And then every 60 seconds, it scans for input. So it looks for, mouse movements or keyboard, whichever you decide, or joystick. Then it applies physics to everything. So it takes all the objects and says, this one needs to do this and this. And then it does an update. Obviously, it says, these are where everybody's at. This is what's happening. Is the apple in the bucket? Yes or no? And then, of course, the renderer spits it on the screen. Sure. Oh, no, I made a mistake there. Yeah, every 60 seconds. Okay, 60 times a second. Yeah. So, yeah, it's not that slow. If it's once every 60 seconds, then yeah, you're going slow. So I did this. So I do want to talk about this vibe coding and JavaScript games. So I decided, this is not a Phaser game, by the way. So I've done this stuff with Phaser. I've built several games. It's really awesome. And then I decided I want to do a 3D racing game because I love racing and I think it would be fun. So I sat down with, I think Claude Code mostly, had these huge long prompts. And I'm like, I want to build this 3D racing game that does all this cool stuff. And this is what it came out with. And I would say it probably took me about an hour to have something playable. And I started to dig in after that, right? And I'm like, I don't know 3JS, hardly at all. I know it better now, but I didn't at the time. I started digging in and fighting with it and just fighting and fighting and fighting to where eventually I'm not going to say how many hours I spent, but I basically gutted out the whole code part of it. And the only thing AI generated is the art, because I'm not an artist, right? And the reason I'm telling you that is because I think that we're going to see that a lot with AI stuff. There's that 80-20 problem that people talk about. Like, you get 80% of the way with AI. And in this case, I'm truly vibe coding because I don't know 3JS. So I really was just like, oh, now it needs this and now it needs this. And I think it's great. I think vibe coding is awesome, especially for proof of concept, quick stuff. And so, if you have a game idea, you can do it, but don't expect to like make this fully functional, playable game, because I fought it like you wouldn't believe. I had cars flying up and down and all over. And yeah, so I ended up gutting it out and writing all my own code, but keeping all the cool art. So, and I'm talking about the future of JS games. that's an image of the future, right? Can you guess where that came from? So I think one of the things that I want to do, and feel free to steal this idea, but I'm going to do this year, is I showed you all that huge array, right? For putting all those bitmaps into place. I want to do something that's like a top-down type game, like Legend of Zelda or something, like old Legend of Zelda, top-down, and I want to take those arrays, feed them into an LLM, and say randomly generate levels so that every person that plays the game gets a different experience. And then have a little thumbs up, thumbs down. We say people were like, oh, do you like this level? And they can just hit thumbs up. Yeah, I like forest level. I like water level. And then feed that back into the LLM and give them more of the type of levels they want. I think that's completely possible. Right now, it only exists in my head, of course. And like I said, feel free to steal the idea, anybody who wants to do it. But I think it would be really cool to implement AI in that way, to like make it so it's a different experience for every single person. And if somebody's like, I don't really like these type of levels, fine, you'll never see them again. Now you'll see a different set of levels. And so I think that would be cool. And I am going to wrap this up with why you should build retro games. I hope I've convinced you in 25 minutes, but nostalgia is fun. So every time I fire up Mike Tyson's Punch-Out or something, or Excite-Bike or whatever, I'm instantly transported back into 1991, like sitting on a living room floor, playing a Nintendo. Social media didn't exist. It was great time. Great time to be alive, let me tell you. And less complexity because of the mechanics of these games and the graphics of these games. They're not very complex. You saw the minimal amount of code. I've built way bigger games, and it's still far less complex than if you're trying to make, Fortnite or something. It's just a level of complexity is super low because that's how it was back then. That's how they had to be, right? They had to be low res, low complexity. And the biggest reason you should build retro games is the community and tool set. I should have brought up itch.io, but I will definitely add it to the slides that we put up there. Itch.io is like the website that covers all the things. And so on there, you will find sprite sets. So like I said, I'm not an artist, so I bought a sprite set for $20 that has bushes and trees and people and houses and all this stuff. And then they also have tools. That's where I found Tiled and several of those other tools. They have those on there. They're free to download with a suggested donation. And I've thrown a few $100s at itch.io over a couple of years, just because, if they make it and put it up there, then I'm like, yeah, cool, we'll send you some money. So it's really cool. And I should probably mention, I wrote a book, Coding with AI. I've got a code so you can get it 50% off if anyone's interested in it. And this is basically, I wrote something that's kind of anti-vibe coding. This book is basically how developers can augment their existing skills, and definitely does not advocate for what I talked about with the race car game where you just sit down and but the book is basically, here's how you can augment your own skills, and here's how you can check yourself and teach yourself with AI and using coding. And I do have one chapter on vibe coding. And also I work for a company called Code Cloud. We do online instruction, a lot of stuff around Kubernetes, DevOps, IT infrastructure. I am the AI person right now, and I need help. So we've got a lot of courses on AI. So if you're interested in possibly becoming an instructor, because we do a lot of part-time contracted type stuff, it doesn't have to, you can keep your full-time job. In fact, a lot of our part-time instructors prefer to work their full-time job because that's what they want to do, and then they do this on the side. So contact me. That's it. Thank you all for coming out here. And I have to do the audience selfie. So everybody pretend like they're asleep. Well, that's awesome. But seriously, thank you everybody for coming in and seeing my nonsense.